My name is Beatrice Turner, and looking back from the vantage point of my 70-odd years, I can see my life's story isn't one of romance but of metallurgy. It's a story forged in fire, quenched in disappointment, and tempered into something strong and useful. My family, you see, had always considered me the lesser daughter, the plain one, a problem to be managed while my sister Rosamond was a prize to be presented. They spent a fortune on her tutors in French and deportment, while my education was stolen from the dusty leather-bound books in my father's library, books on chemistry and engineering. They groomed her for a glittering marriage that would save our family's fading name, while they despaired that I would ever find a husband at all. They never imagined that the very man they hoped would fall for my sister's polished graces would, instead, make me a proposal that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with steel. It was a proposal that would build an empire and shatter my family's every expectation, proving that a mind full of calculations could be infinitely more valuable than a face full of beauty. Before I dive into how a smudge of coal dust on my cheek proved more alluring than my sister's perfect smile, I'd love to know where you're all watching from today. Let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever felt underestimated or had a passion that others just didn't understand, go ahead and hit that like button. For all the new viewers here, make sure you subscribe, because this is a community for people who know that our real worth is often found in the places others refuse to look. Our family's world was built on iron. The Turner name was synonymous with Turner Ironworks, a sprawling, soot-stained giant that squatted by the river and had for generations supplied the backbone for a growing nation. But my father, Lord Edmund Turner, was a man caught between two worlds. He held an old title that commanded respect in the drawing rooms of London, but that title was propped up by the very industry he was starting to resent. To him, the ironworks were a noisy, dirty necessity, a means to fund the life of refined leisure he felt was his birthright. He loved the wealth it generated, but loathed the grit of its creation. This conflict defined my childhood, and more specifically, the chasm between my sister and me. Rosamond was my father's masterpiece. She was 2 years older, and from the moment of her birth, she seemed to have been blessed by every benevolent fairy. Her hair was the color of spun gold, her eyes a startling blue, and her laughter sounded like wind chimes. She was the living embodiment of our mother's societal ambitions and our father's desire for aristocratic perfection. Her days were a carefully curated curriculum of elegance. She learned to play the piano with a delicate touch that could make grown men sigh. Her French was flawless. Her embroidery was exquisite. She moved through our drafty ancestral home like a sunbeam, all grace and light, and my parents basked in her glow. I, on the other hand, was a shadow. I was Beatrice. Plain, quiet Beatrice. My hair was a nondescript brown, my eyes a muted hazel, and my natural state was one of intense, silent observation. While Rosamond was mastering the waltz, I was hiding in the corner of my father's library, devouring books that were definitely not meant for a young girl. I wasn't interested in poetry or romance novels. I was captivated by diagrams of blast furnaces, by chemical equations that explain the transformation of ore into iron, by the dense, complex theories of metallurgy. The ironworks, which my father saw as a vulgar necessity, I saw as a place of magnificent, fiery magic. The rhythmic clang of the hammers was a symphony to me. The roar of the furnaces was a dragon's breath, and the molten iron that flowed in glowing rivers was the lifeblood of our family. My earliest memory is not of a doll or a tea party, but of my grandfather, a man who still had calluses on his hands, taking me on a secret tour of the works. I was only 5, but I can still feel the intense dry heat on my face, smell the acrid tang of coal smoke, and see the shower of brilliant orange sparks from the trip hammer. He'd crouched down, his face lined with wisdom and soot, and pointed. "See that bee?" he'd said, his voice a low rumble against the din. "That's power, that's creation. Never let anyone tell you it's just dirt and noise." My grandfather died a year later, and with him went the only person who understood my fascination. My father actively discouraged it. It was, in his words, a most unnatural and unladylike obsession. One afternoon, when I was about 10, a new governess, Miss Gable, was attempting to teach me needlepoint. My stitches were clumsy, my thread tangled. I found the entire exercise mind-numbingly dull. After half an hour of her frustrated sighs, I flipped the taut fabric over, and using a piece of charcoal I'd smuggled from a fireplace, began sketching a detailed diagram of a water wheel on the pristine linen. I was explaining the mechanics of the buckets and the transfer of energy to a bewildered housemaid when Miss Gable returned. Her shriek brought my mother running. The sight of my grubby hands and the ruined needlepoint canvas was an affront to everything she stood for. I was taken to my father's study, not for a discussion but for a lecture. "This is precisely what I am talking about," he'd fumed, pacing in front of the cold hearth. "Machinery. Dirt. It is not the concern of a young lady. Rosamond would never dream of such a thing. She understands her purpose. Your purpose, Beatrice, is to be quiet, to be pleasant, and to not cause embarrassment." The message was clear. Rosamond was an asset to be polished. I was a liability to be contained. The pattern repeated itself endlessly. When a visiting engineer came for dinner, I listened, rapt, as he discussed the limitations of our puddling furnaces. I waited for a pause and asked, "Sir, have you read about Mr. Bessemer's new pneumatic process? It seems it could convert pig iron to steel in minutes rather than hours." The man's eyes lit up with interest, but before he could answer, my father's hand clamped down on my shoulder. "Beatrice, the adults are speaking," he'd said, his voice dangerously low. The shame was a physical heat that spread from my scalp to my toes. I was sent from the table. Later that night, I heard Rosamond practicing a new Chopin piece on the piano, the beautiful, effortless notes drifting up the stairs, a perfect soundtrack to my failure. As we grew into young women, the divergence became even more stark. Rosamond blossomed. She was presented at court, her dance card was always full, and suitors flocked around her like moths to a flame. She wasn't cruel to me, not actively. She simply didn't see me. I was a part of the household furniture, a quiet presence in the corner of the room. Her world was a whirl of silk gowns, whispered secrets, and social triumphs. My world was the ironworks. I would sneak out of the house at dawn, dressed in an old stable boy's coat and cap, and watch the morning shift begin. I knew the foremen, the puddlers, the smiths. They regarded me with a sort of gruff, bewildered affection. I wasn't their master's daughter. I was the strange girl who asked intelligent questions, who could spot a flaw in a casting from 20 paces, who understood the precise shade of orange that meant the furnace was at its optimal temperature. I kept detailed notebooks, filling them with observations, calculations, and designs for improvements. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that Turner Ironworks was dying. My father, in his stubborn pride, refused to modernize. He clung to the old, labor-intensive puddling process for creating wrought iron, viewing the new methods of mass-producing steel as cheap and vulgar. He didn't understand that the world was changing. Railroads were crisscrossing continents, buildings were reaching for the sky, and ships were being forged from steel plates, not oak planks. Wrought iron was the past, steel was the future. Our family's finances, a topic spoken of only in hushed, panicked tones, reflected this decay. I would sit on the upper landing, hidden in the shadows, and listen to my parents' late-night arguments drifting from the study below. "The creditors are becoming impatient, Edmund," my mother's strained voice would say. "We cannot afford Rosamond's London season next year. If things continue like this, something will turn up." My father would bluster, his tone lacking conviction. "A good match for Rosamond. That is the key. A marriage to Lord Ashworth's son, perhaps, or that shipping magnate. He has no title," my mother would gasp. "He has a fortune, my dear, which is far more useful at this point." I once gathered all my courage and approached my father with one of my notebooks. I had spent weeks drafting a proposal, complete with cost analysis and production projections, for converting one of our smaller furnaces to a Bessemer-style converter. I explained how it would increase our output tenfold and allow us to bid on lucrative railway contracts. I tried to show him the numbers, the undeniable logic of it. He didn't even look at my notebook. He simply pushed it aside on his mahogany desk, his expression a mixture of pity and irritation. "Beatrice, I have indulged your little hobby for far too long. This is the world of men, of business. What would a girl who has never balanced a household budget know of such things? Your concern should be finding a respectable, if modest, husband who can tolerate your eccentricities. Leave the ironworks to me. Now please, go and see if your sister needs help choosing a ribbon for the evening. That is a task better suited to your abilities." He dismissed my life's passion as a little hobby. He dismissed the potential salvation of his company as the nonsensical scribbling of a child. I walked out of his study that day with his words ringing in my ears, and something inside me began to harden. It was not anger, not yet. It was a cold, heavy resignation. He would never see me. He would let his pride sink us all before he would listen to his plain, strange daughter. All his hopes, all his dreams, all the weight of our family's future rested on Rosamond's slender, graceful shoulders. Our salvation, he believed, would not come from the fire of the furnace, but from the glitter of the ballroom. The news arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a special messenger, and contained within a letter bearing a crisp, unfamiliar seal from a London solicitor. It announced the impending arrival of a Mr. Julian Blackwood. The name meant nothing to my parents at first, but the solicitor's letter explained everything in reverent detail. Blackwood was an American, a railway magnate of staggering wealth and ambition. He had built thousands of miles of track across the United States and was now turning his attention to Britain, planning a new modern network of lines that would revolutionize transport in the north of England. He was, the letter stated, seeking an English partner, specifically a partner with an established foundry and access to raw materials, who could be retooled to produce the colossal quantities of steel rail his project demanded. He was, in short, a king of the new industrial age, and he was coming to our home. The letter sent a jolt of electricity through our household. For my father, it was as if a divine hand had reached down from the heavens. This was it. This was the answer to all his prayers. Not a dusty lord with a mortgaged estate, but a man of limitless New World wealth. A man who could not only save Turner Ironworks but elevate it, and us, to unimaginable heights. The fact that Blackwood was a new money colonial without a drop of noble blood was a detail my father was suddenly, miraculously willing to overlook. "Rosamond," he boomed, striding into the morning room where we sat. "This is your moment. A man of this caliber will need a wife. An English rose to temper his American roughness. A lady of breeding to be his hostess, to smooth his way into society." My mother was already fluttering, her mind racing. "Her blue silk, Edmund. We must have it altered."
"And the pearls. He must see her in the pearls."
The entire house was thrown into a state of organized panic. It was less like preparing for a guest and more like preparing for a royal inspection. Staff scurried, silver was polished until it gleamed, and menus were planned and replanned. Rosamond was the center of this whirlwind. She was coached and drilled. My mother reviewed her conversation topics: art, music, literature, a bit of harmless society gossip. She was to be charming, but not forward, intelligent, but not intimidating, beautiful, but not vain. She was being polished like a precious gem for display. Rosamond, for her part, took to the role with practiced ease. This was the moment she had been trained for her entire life. She understood the stakes. She saw the worry in our father's eyes, and the desperation behind our mother's frantic energy. She was the family's champion, and this was her tournament. "Don't worry, father," she said one evening, her hand resting on his arm. "I understand what must be done." My role in all of this was, as usual, to be invisible. My mother took me aside a few days before Blackwood's scheduled arrival. "Beatrice, dear," she began, her voice strained with false gentleness. "When Mr. Blackwood is here, I want you to be on your very best behavior. That means you are to listen more than you speak. You will not mention the ironworks. You will not discuss anything technical. We want him to see us as a family of refinement." Her eyes scanned my simple day dress with disapproval. "And for heaven's sake, try not to look so intense. It can be very off-putting. And wash your hands. They always seem to have a trace of soot under the nails, no matter how much you scrub." I didn't argue. I just nodded, the familiar coldness settling in my chest. They weren't just asking me to be quiet. They were asking me to erase the very essence of who I was. I was the inconvenient truth of our family, the grit beneath the gilded surface. They wanted to present a fantasy of aristocratic leisure, and my passion for the very source of our wealth was a crack in that facade. But beneath my resignation, a flicker of something else sparked to life: curiosity. I had read about men like Julian Blackwood in the newspapers and journals I devoured. They were a new breed, men who built fortunes not from inherited land, but from vision, grit, and innovation. They were men of iron and steel in a far more literal sense than my father. They were the future. I found myself wondering what a man like that would be like. Would he be as loud and brash as the papers portrayed Americans? Or would he be sharp, focused, a man who understood that true power lay not in a title, but in the ability to bend the world to your will with fire and metal? I was to be a silent spectator at my sister's grand performance, but I resolved to be an observant one. I would watch this man, this architect of the future, and I would learn. The night of Julian Blackwood's arrival was a masterpiece of orchestrated perfection. The long dining table was set with our finest china and silver, glowing under the light of 100 candles. A string quartet played softly in the grand hall. Rosamond was breathtaking. She wore the blue silk gown which perfectly matched her eyes, and our grandmother's pearls gleamed against her flawless skin. She looked every inch the aristocrat, the perfect English rose my father had envisioned. I was seated at the far end of the table, placed strategically between a deaf great-aunt and a shy cousin, effectively neutralized. When Blackwood was announced, he was not what I had expected. He was younger than the newspapers suggested, perhaps in his early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was dressed impeccably, but he wore his suit with a casual disregard for ceremony, as if it were a necessary uniform. There was an energy about him, a coiled stillness that made my father's blustering welcome seem slow and foolish. He was polite. His manners were correct. But there was no deference. He shook my father's hand with a firm, decisive grip, his gaze direct and assessing. He was seated next to Rosamond, of course. The performance began. Rosamond, perfectly executing her instructions, was a vision of charming grace. She spoke of her recent visit to a London art gallery. She inquired about the opera in New York. She even managed a few sentences in flawless French, which Blackwood answered in perfect, unaccented English, a subtle power play that went right over my parents' heads. I watched him. He listened. He nodded. He made all the right responses, but his eyes were distant. There was a profound, almost aggressive boredom settling on his features. He wasn't being rude, but he was utterly, completely disengaged. It was like watching a master watchmaker being forced to discuss crochet. My father tried to steer the conversation towards topics he thought would impress an industrialist. He spoke of hunting, of land management, of the long and storied history of Turner Ironworks. Our methods are traditional, of course, my father said with a proud puff of his chest. Passed down through generations. Quality and heritage. That's the Turner way. Tradition doesn't lay track, Lord Turner, Blackwood responded, his voice flat. He turned his attention from my father and tried a new tactic, attempting to engage the table on his own terms. The real challenge isn't just volume, it's consistency. With the new high-speed locomotives, the tensile strength of the rails is everything. A single brittle rail can derail a train and cost a fortune, not to mention lives. What's the tensile strength of your current puddled iron? The question fell into the polite chatter like a lump of pig iron. The air went still. My father, who barely knew the difference between pig iron and a fireplace poker, blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it, a flush creeping up his neck. He looked to his foreman, who was not present. He looked to the ceiling, as if the answer might be written there. I could see the gears in his mind grinding, searching for a suitably vague and lordly response that would mask his complete ignorance. I didn't even think. The words just came out, quiet but clear in the sudden silence. Our puddled iron has a tensile strength of roughly 20 tons per square inch, Mr. Blackwood. All heads turned towards me. I could feel my father's glare burning into the side of my face, a look of pure fury. But Blackwood's eyes, those sharp, assessing eyes, were now fixed on me, and for the first time that evening they held a spark of genuine interest. I felt a knot of fear in my stomach, but I pressed on, the knowledge inside me demanding to be heard. But it's brittle under high-speed stress, especially in cold weather. For modern rails, you'd need Bessemer steel, which can exceed 35 tons and has far greater elasticity due to the lower carbon content. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so profound I could hear the wax of a candle drip onto a silver holder. My mother looked as if she might faint. Rosamond was staring at me with a look of utter bewilderment, as if the salt cellar had just started reciting poetry. My father's face had gone from red to a terrifying mottled purple. He looked like he was about to have an apoplectic fit. But Julian Blackwood simply leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving my face. And what about the phosphorus and sulfur content? That's the real devil in steel production. I forgot where I was. I forgot my father's rage and my mother's horror. I was in my element. It is, I agreed, my voice gaining confidence. But adding ferromanganese during the final stage can help remove the excess oxygen and sulfur, preventing the steel from becoming brittle during rolling. The key is the precision of the admixture. Precisely, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the first genuine expression I had seen from him all night. He looked at me as if he were a prospector who had been panning a worthless stream all day and had just found a massive, gleaming nugget of gold. My father could bear it no longer. He slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "That is quite enough, Beatrice," he roared. "Mr. Blackwood is our guest. He does not wish to be bored with your textbooks." He turned to Blackwood, forcing a jovial, desperate smile. "A young woman's fancies, you understand. She reads too much. Rosamond, my dear, why don't you play something for us on the pianoforte after dinner? Her Chopin is truly a delight." The conversation was wrenched away from me, but the damage was done. The spell was broken. For the rest of the dinner, Blackwood's responses to Rosamond were as polite and distant as before, but every few minutes I would feel his eyes on me from across the table, his expression thoughtful and calculating. I had broken every rule. I had embarrassed my family, and in doing so, I had captured the attention of the one man in the room who truly mattered. The next morning, Julian Blackwood was insistent. He did not want to go shooting, nor did he want to see the gardens. He wanted a tour of the ironworks. My father, forced to acquiesce, put on the air of a proud lord showing off his domain, but it was a thin veneer over his anxiety. He led the way, with Rosamond gliding elegantly beside him, a stark contrast to the gritty industrial landscape. She held a parasol to protect her complexion from the sun and the soot, looking utterly and completely out of place. I was instructed to trail behind the group, to remain present but silent. The works were a hive of activity, a cacophony of steam, fire, and hammering metal. My father pointed out the grand old furnaces with their stone facades, speaking of their history and tradition. Blackwood said nothing, but his eyes swept over everything, and I knew what he was seeing. He saw the inefficient layout, the outdated machinery, the wasted manpower, the plumes of black smoke that signaled incomplete combustion and wasted fuel. He saw decay masquerading as heritage. As my father was engrossed in a self-important lecture to the foreman about a recent order, Blackwood casually dropped back from the main group. He fell into step beside me, his long strides easily matching my own. "Your father's foreman is a fool," he said without preamble, his voice low and direct. "His furnace charging is all wrong. He's layering the coke and ore in uneven measures. He's wasting at least 20% of his fuel and creating hot spots that will damage the furnace lining." I was so startled by his bluntness that I could only nod in agreement. "I've told him," I said, finding my voice. "He needs to use a double-bell charging system to distribute the burden more evenly, but he says it's not how his father did it." "His father probably didn't have to compete with German steel mills," Blackwood retorted dryly. His eyes met mine. "You see it, don't you? The waste, the inefficiency." "I see potential," I corrected him gently. "This entire bank of furnaces could be replaced with 2 modern open-hearth furnaces. You'd double the output, and be able to use scrap metal in the charge, lowering material costs." We had stopped walking. My father and Rosamond were some distance ahead, oblivious, a pretty portrait against a backdrop of industrial grime. Blackwood was looking at me with that same intense focus as the night before. He was testing me, pushing me. "Open hearth is slow," he challenged. "For the sheer volume of rails I need, Bessemer is faster." "Bessemer is faster," I conceded. "But it's a violent process, harder to control for quality. You can't test the molten metal mid-blow. With an open hearth furnace, you can take samples, analyze them, and adjust the additives to get the exact chemical composition you need, every single time. For something as critical as rails, wouldn't you prefer precision over speed?" He was silent for a long moment, just studying my face. I realized we were standing near the small, disused shed that I had claimed as my own private workshop and study. On impulse, driven by a desperate need for him to understand that my knowledge wasn't just from books, I said, "Come with me. I want to show you something." I led him into the shed. It was cramped and dusty, smelling of oil and cold iron. On a large workbench spread out under the light from a grimy window were my notebooks, dozens of them. They were filled with my cramped, precise handwriting, with diagrams, chemical formulas, and complex calculations. I opened one and showed him my designs for a regenerative heating system for an open hearth furnace, a way to use the hot waste gases to preheat the incoming fuel and air, drastically increasing its thermal efficiency. I showed him another with detailed metallurgical analyses of different iron ores from the region. He picked up one of the notebooks, his fingers tracing one of my diagrams. He was utterly absorbed, turning the pages with a reverence I had never witnessed from anyone. "You did this?" he asked, his voice quiet with something that sounded like awe. "By yourself?" "There was no one else to ask," I said simply. He looked up from the notebook, his eyes locking with mine. In that moment, something profound passed between us. It wasn't romance, it was recognition. He saw me, the real me, the person who lived in these pages of calculations and designs, the person my own family had spent my entire life trying to suppress. "Beatrice," he said, and it was the first time he had used my given name. This is extraordinary." We spent what felt like an hour in that shed, talking about the properties of manganese, the future of steel alloys, the logistics of building a modern steel mill from the ground up. We weren't a man and a woman, we were two minds, perfectly in tune, speaking the same language of industry and innovation. It was the most exhilarating conversation of my life. When we finally emerged from the shed, blinking in the daylight, we saw my father and Rosamond waiting near the manor gate. They had clearly been waiting for some time. Rosamond's perfect posture was stiff with impatience, and my father's face was a thundercloud. They watched us walk back across the yard, our heads close together as we continued our discussion, completely oblivious to their silent, furious judgment. I saw Rosamond's expression change. It wasn't just annoyance. I saw a flicker of confusion, of a strange and unfamiliar emotion that looked almost like fear. It was the fear of irrelevance. For the first time in her life, the spotlight had moved, and she didn't know why. My father, however, was not confused. He was incandescent with rage. That evening, the storm broke. I was summoned to my father's study, the same room where he had dismissed my dreams so many times before. The air was thick with his fury. He stood by the fireplace, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. "How dare you?" he began, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "How dare you humiliate me and this family in such a manner?" "I don't know what you mean," I said, my own voice steadier than I felt. "Don't play the fool with me, Beatrice," he snapped. "You deliberately upstaged your sister. You flaunted yourself in front of our guest, chattering on about subjects that are no concern of yours. You disappeared with him for over an hour. What do you think people will say? You made a spectacle of yourself with that colonial upstart." His words were meant to crush me, to send me scurrying back into my shell. But something had shifted in me during that conversation in the shed. I had been seen. I had been validated. The foundation of my lifelong timidity had developed a crack. "He is not an upstart, father," I said, my voice rising to meet his. "He is a brilliant man who is building the future, a future that Turner Ironworks could be a part of, if you would only open your eyes." "The future of Turner Ironworks is my concern," he thundered. "Your concern was to be a dutiful daughter and support your sister. She was meant to be the focus. Your duty is to be quiet." "My duty?" I shot back, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Is it my duty to stand by and watch this family's legacy rust into the ground because of pride?" He asked questions, and I knew the answers. Rosamond did not. You did not. Is knowledge a spectacle? Is competence an embarrassment? Perhaps if you had spent less time teaching her French and more time teaching her about the very business that pays for her silk gowns, she would have been able to hold his interest for more than 5 minutes. The slap was so sudden I didn't see it coming. His hand cracked across my cheek, the force of it sending me stumbling back a step. The sting was sharp, but the shock was sharper. He had never raised a hand to me in my life. We stared at each other in the silent aftermath, his chest heaving, his face a mask of regret and fury. My cheek throbbed, a hot, pulsing testament to the line that had just been crossed. "You will go to your room," he said, his voice now a ragged whisper, "and you will stay there until Mr. Blackwood has gone. You have done enough damage." I didn't say another word. I turned and walked out of the study, my head held high, the stinging on my cheek a strange and painful badge of honor. I had spoken the truth, and for that, I had been punished. But as I climbed the stairs to my room, I knew that whatever happened next, I could no longer be the silent, dutiful daughter he wanted me to be. That girl was gone forever. The next afternoon, a housemaid knocked on my door. "My lord requests your presence in the study, miss," she said, her eyes carefully avoiding my face. Though I knew the faint bruise on my cheek was still visible, I assumed I was being summoned for another lecture, or perhaps a forced apology. My stomach tightened into a cold knot. As I approached the study, I heard voices from within. My father's, tense and agitated, and Julian Blackwood's, calm and resolute. I saw a flash of blue silk in the shadows of the hallway. Rosamond, eavesdropping, her body rigid with tension. She saw me and her eyes widened, a mixture of triumph and anxiety in her gaze. She clearly believed, as I did, that this meeting was about her, the final negotiation. She put a finger to her lips, urging me to be silent. The housemaid knocked and opened the door. "Miss Beatrice, my lord." My father, looking pale and strained, waved me in. Julian Blackwood stood as I entered. He gave me a brief, unreadable look before turning his attention back to my father, who was slumped behind his large desk like a defeated king. "As I was saying, Lord Turner," Blackwood continued as if I had been there all along, "I have a proposal for you. It is a business proposal, first and foremost." My father gestured weakly at the papers on his desk. "Yes, the investment, the partnership. We can discuss the terms." "The terms are straightforward," Blackwood cut in, his voice leaving no room for argument. "But they are contingent on one non-negotiable condition. My partner in this venture must be completely aligned with my vision." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent room. "I have spent the last 2 days observing your family and your operations, and I must be frank. I am not interested in your daughter Rosamond." I saw my father flinch as if he had been struck. From the corner of my eye, I saw the shadow in the hall recoil. Blackwood went on, his tone devoid of malice, a simple statement of fact. "She is a fine lady, a credit to your society. She would make some lord a beautiful and accomplished wife. But I am not in England for a society wife, sir. I am here to build, to create. I am here to forge the arteries of this nation in steel, and for that I need more than a hostess. I need a partner. I need a mind that understands the fire. I need steel." He took a step towards the desk, his presence filling the room. "My proposal is this. I will provide the capital to build the most advanced steel mill in Europe on your land. We will call it the Blackwood and Turner Steel Company. It will be a titan of industry. It will secure your family's name and fortune for a century to come." He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. "And the person I want to run that mill with me, to be my partner in this enterprise, is your daughter Beatrice." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My father stared at him, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked from Blackwood to me and back again, as if trying to solve an impossible equation. You mean as a manager? A consultant?" he stammered, the very idea absurd to him. "No," Blackwood said firmly. "I mean as my wife. This will be a partnership in every sense of the word, a union of capital and intellect, of vision and knowledge. We will build an empire together, Lord Turner. Your name will be on the greatest steelworks in Britain, and my partner will be the woman who understands the soul of it better than any man I have ever met. I am asking for Beatrice's hand in marriage." My father was utterly speechless. He looked at me, his plain daughter with the bruised cheek, and for the first time I think he saw me not as a disappointment, but as an utterly incomprehensible and terrifying asset. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then Julian Blackwood turned away from my father and walked directly to me, stopping just a few feet away. He ignored my father completely, as if he were no longer part of the equation. His eyes, sharp and clear, met mine. The calculating look was gone, replaced by an expression of profound, almost stark respect. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice softer now, "meant only for me. I find your mind to be the most compelling thing I have encountered in this country. I am building a railway empire, and I require a partner with a will of iron and a knowledge of steel. I am not offering you a life of drawing rooms and idle chatter. I am not offering you poetry and moonlight. I am offering you a life of fire, of innovation, of purpose. I am offering you a seat at the head of the table, not at the foot of it. I am offering you a partnership in business and in life. Will you marry me and build this future with me?" It wasn't a declaration of love. It was a declaration of respect. It wasn't a plea from a suitor. It was a proposition from an equal. He wasn't asking for my heart. He was asking for my mind. He saw the person I kept hidden in notebooks and dirty sheds, and he was not only unafraid of her, he was actively seeking her out. I looked past him to my father, who was still gaping like a landed fish. I saw the ghost of my sister's silhouette in the hall, a statue of shattered dreams. This was my moment. A choice. I could remain in this house, a bruised and silenced footnote in my family's story, Or I could step into the fire with this man and forge a new life, a new identity. My cheeks still throbbed where my father had hit me, a dull, aching reminder of the price of speaking my mind in this house. Blackwood was offering me a world where my mind was my greatest asset. The choice was not a choice at all. I met his gaze, my back straight, my voice clear and steady. "Yes," I said. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood, I will." The aftermath of my acceptance was quiet, contained chaos. My mother took to her bed with a case of nerves, while my father walked the halls in a daze, caught between the sheer humiliation of the situation and the undeniable allure of Blackwood's millions. Rosamond locked herself in her room and refused to speak to anyone, particularly me. The family's great champion had been passed over for the stable mouse, and the shame was more than she could bear. There was no joy, no celebration. My engagement was treated like a business merger, which, in essence, it was. Blackwood was ruthlessly efficient. Lawyers were summoned, contracts were drawn up. I insisted on being present for the negotiations, a demand that scandalized my father but which Julian, he insisted I call him Julian now, supported without question. I sat at the great mahogany table in the study, across from my father, and read every clause. I even added one of my own, a stipulation that 10% of the new company's annual profits must be reinvested into research and development. My father, defeated and bewildered, signed the documents that his own daughter had helped draft, officially ceding control of his legacy. It was a profound and permanent shift in power. The wedding was a swift, practical affair held in the local village church, attended by only a handful of people. Rosamond refused to be my maid of honor, claiming a sudden illness. Her absence was a statement, a final, silent protest. As I stood at the altar beside Julian, I felt no romantic flutterings, only a sense of profound, terrifying purpose. We exchanged vows that felt more like oaths of allegiance. When he slipped the simple gold band on my finger, it felt less like a symbol of love and more like the seal on a contract. The farewell at the manor was cold and stiff. My mother, pale and drawn, offered a brittle cheek to kiss. My father shook my hand, his grip limp, his eyes refusing to meet mine. "You have made your choice, Beatrice," he said, his voice flat. "I hope it brings you what you are looking for." It was not a blessing. Rosamond did not appear at all. As the carriage pulled away from the home where I had spent my entire life feeling like a ghost, I felt a sharp pang of sorrow for the family I was leaving, but it was quickly overwhelmed by a dizzying surge of liberation. I was no longer Beatrice Turner, the plain sister. I was Beatrice Blackwood, partner in an empire yet to be built. Our life together began not in a honeymoon cottage, but on a ship bound for America. Our stateroom was filled with rolled-up blueprints and geological survey maps. Our first week of marriage was spent with me learning the intricacies of his American business holdings and him grilling me on the chemical composition of British coal seams. It was the most stimulating and intellectually demanding time of my life. Our conversations were not the stilted, polite exchanges of a newly married couple. They were passionate, often heated, debates about furnace linings, railway gauges, and labor relations. He took me to Pittsburgh, a city wreathed in smoke and lit by the eternal fires of its steel mills. It was a vision of hell to some, but to me it was magnificent. It was a city built on the principles I had only read about in books. Julian's mills were vast, modern, and brutally efficient. He introduced me not to society hostesses, but to his engineers, his foremen, his chemists. At first, they were skeptical. I was the English wife, the aristocrat. They looked at my soft hands and my quiet demeanor and dismissed me. One evening, Julian took me into a meeting with his chief engineer, a gruff, brilliant man named McPherson, who was having trouble with a new batch of steel plate for a boiler. It was too brittle, cracking under pressure tests. McPherson was blaming the iron ore. I listened for 10 minutes as he described the process, and then I asked to see the lab reports. I scanned the columns of figures, my mind racing through the chemical equations. "It's not the ore, Mr. McPherson," I said quietly. "Your manganese levels are too low, but the real problem is the timing. You're adding it too late in the process. The molten steel isn't hot enough for it to properly deoxidize the batch. You're left with microscopic oxygen bubbles that are creating fracture points." McPherson stared at me, his jaw tight with indignation. "With all due respect, ma'am, I've been making steel for 20 years. Julian, who had been watching from the side, held up a hand, but he didn't defend me. He simply said, "Humor her, Mac. Try it her way on the next batch." His trust was a quiet, unshakable thing. It was more powerful than any loud defense. He was giving me the space to prove myself. McPherson, grumbling, agreed. The next day, they ran a new batch using my precise temperature and timing specifications. The resulting steel plate passed every pressure test with flying colors. McPherson came to my office that afternoon, hat in his hand, his expression one of grudging awe. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, "I was wrong. I won't make the mistake of underestimating you again." From that day on, the skepticism from the other men vanished, replaced by a deep and genuine respect. I had earned my place. When we returned to England 6 months later to break ground on the Blackwood and Turner Steel Company, I was a different woman. The timid, overlooked girl was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own mind and her own worth. Our life was work. We lived in a modest house near the construction site, and our days were spent in boots, covered in mud and dust, overseeing every detail. I designed the layout of the rolling mill myself, creating a flow of work that was 20% more efficient than any other mill in Britain. Our intimacy was not born of candlelight and whispers, but of shared struggle and mutual triumph. It was found in the quiet moments late at night in the site office, both of us exhausted, poring over plans, when his hand would come to rest on my shoulder. It was in the look of pride in his eyes when I solved a complex engineering problem that had stumped his entire team. He didn't love the woman society expected me to be. He loved the woman I truly was, and in the crucible of our shared ambition, respect slowly, surely tempered into a deep and abiding love. It was a love as strong and as reliable as the steel we created. 5 years passed in a blur of fire and industry. The Blackwood and Turner Steel Company became a Goliath, a symbol of the new industrial Britain. Our rails connected cities, our steel-framed skyscrapers. Our name was synonymous with quality and innovation. In the business world, I was no longer known as Lord Turner's plain daughter, but as Mrs. Blackwood, the Iron Lady, a formidable figure who could negotiate a contract with the shrewdness of a banker and discuss the thermodynamics of a furnace with the precision of a chemist. Julian and I had built our empire, and we had built a life. Our love, unconventional in its beginnings, had deepened into a partnership that was the bedrock of my world. We had a son, Thomas, a bright, curious boy who had my eyes and Julian's determined chin. My greatest joy was not in boardrooms or at society balls, which we rarely attended, but in sitting on the nursery floor with Thomas, explaining to him the workings of a miniature steam engine he'd received for his 4th birthday. I was giving him the childhood I had always craved, one where curiosity was nurtured, not stifled. One morning, a letter arrived bearing a black wax seal. It was from my mother. My father, Lord Edmund Turner, had passed away peacefully in his sleep. His heart, the doctor said. The old ironworks, which he had refused to sell and had become a rusting, silent monument to his pride, had finally drained the last of the family's old money. He died land-rich and cash-poor. We returned to Turner Manor for the funeral. The house was cold, a feeling that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. A creeping damp had stained the wallpaper, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. My mother seemed to have shrunk, a fragile, bewildered woman lost in the cavernous, crumbling rooms of her past. Rosamond was there, of course. She had married a baronet with a distinguished name and a heavily mortgaged estate a few years after I had left. The match had been a disappointment for my parents, a far cry from the glittering prize they had once envisioned for her. She was still beautiful, but it was a tired, brittle beauty. There were fine lines of worry around her perfect blue eyes. After the funeral, as Julian was speaking quietly with my mother's solicitor, Rosamond found me in the old library. We stood in silence for a long time, the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken words between us. She looked at me, taking in my simple, well-cut woolen dress, my confident posture, the quiet authority I now carried without effort. Her gaze drifted to the window, where she could see Julian watching over Thomas, who was chasing autumn leaves on the lawn. She saw the easy affection in his posture, the clear adoration in his eyes whenever he looked at his wife and son. "He loves you," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, tinged with a weary sort of wonder. "Yes," I said, "he does." She turned her gaze from the window and looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in our lives. "You were always the clever one, Beatrice," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I never understood what you were doing, hiding away with all those dusty old books. I thought it was just strange. Now I see." She gestured vaguely at the room, at the house, at the life she was trapped in. And yet you ended up with everything. It wasn't an apology, it was a confession. An acknowledgement of a truth that had been buried under decades of gilded favoritism. It was, in its own way, enough. I felt a lifetime of resentment begin to dissolve, replaced by a quiet, surprising pity for this sister, who had been given all the advantages and had ended up with so little. She had been groomed for a world that was already fading, while I, the misfit, had been accidentally prepared for the one that was being born. My father had wanted a daughter who was an ornament, a beautiful passive reflection of his own status. My husband wanted a partner who was an asset, a sharp, active mind to help him build his vision. And in becoming that asset, in a world of fire and iron, I had finally discovered my own unshakable worth. It wasn't something a father could give or a husband could bestow. It was something I had forged for myself. I hope my story can be a small reminder that your value isn't determined by the people who refuse to see it. Sometimes the things that make us outcasts in one world are the very things that make us pioneers in another. The greatest strength can come from embracing the passions that others dismiss as flaws. I would love to read your stories in the comments below. Have you ever turned something others saw as a weakness into your greatest strength? How did you learn to value your own unique knowledge? Don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and please subscribe for more stories about finding our own way. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. Remember that family is ultimately defined by love and respect, not just by blood, and true partnership is built on a foundation of shared purpose.